Hello crafters, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSTM.com. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. In this video, I'm making colorful abstract background birthday cards with the Simons Stamp Positively Saturated inks and Best Year Yet stamp set. All supplies I'm using in this video are listed and linked in the video description below. I finally made a color chart for my Simons Stamp Positively Saturated inks, and having this color chart has made making my stamping color choices and color decisions so much more easier. So if you don't have an ink chart for your inks, whichever inks you're using, I highly encourage you to create a color chart. It will make your stamping life so much easier. So I have already picked a few colors of ink. Here I have the bright version, GUAVA, CITRINE, TIDEPOOL, and ASPEN. And I also have a lighter version of this color combination. I'll be using it later on in my video. And the lighter color version is Cheeky, SUNBEAM, SEAFOAM, and ASPEN. So ASPEN is the same color that I'm using for both cards, but the other three colors are different. You can do this technique with any other color combination you like. I picked the bright and the cheerful colors as I'm making birthday cards. And of course, we all want our birthday cards to be bright and cheerful and happy. I already have a panel of white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. This is Simons Stamp 130-pound cardstock. It is my go-to paper for anything stamping related or Copic marker related. This paper is super smooth, and that makes it absolutely perfect for this technique. But that doesn't mean that you cannot try this technique on another type of paper. You just want to make sure that you aren't using something with texture. So the smoother your paper, the better. If you find you have good hot foiling results on some type of paper, try that paper for this technique. It might work. As long as that paper is not synthetic, you'll have good results with this technique as well. Now, the idea is to use direct-to-paper application method and simply gently glide your ink pad across the paper to transfer the ink. So start with a very light hand. Do not press too hard because the harder you press, the more ink will come out. I prefer to go in with a very light hand and increase the pressure by just a little bit as I go along. Applying ink in this way gives you uneven ink coverage. You get sections that are darker, sections that are lighter. Some might even be without ink at all. And that all makes it very unique. It's not like, an ink blended background or stamped background. This will be different every single time you do it. I make sure to clean the work surface before I switch to the next color of ink to avoid contaminating my ink pad with the ink that's already on my glass mat. So I just wipe it clean using a stamp chamois. Next, I start to apply my next color. Now, I want to have 4 sections here, and to make sure that I fill all of them, I need to use just a portion of the ink pad. I don't want the stripe, the colorful stripe, as wide as my ink pad. I need it narrower. So I'm angling the ink pad using just one edge of the pad to apply the color. Again, I end up with an uneven edge, creating a beautiful abstract stripe. I then went to add the bottom stripe. Now this will help me section my panel a little bit better because I am eyeballing everything. I did not measure these sections precisely. Now, depending on how juicy your ink pads are, you might need to work a little harder to get the ink onto your paper. Or if you have re-inkers, it might be a good idea to re-ink your pad if they feel dry. You might get a lot more ink onto the paper if you re-ink your ink pads. So as you can see, I first applied the color, leaving wide gaps between my stripes. But I later came back and made the color sections wider, almost overlapping. I did overlap the pink and yellow. That resulted in a hint of orange here, and I just love the way this looks. Why not? So cool. Here's a look at how I made the lighter version of this background. I just used lighter ink colors and followed the same principle to create my colorful background. Remember that you can use this with any other colors. I encourage you to try out your favorite color combinations and see how that looks. So with the backgrounds created, I moved on to stamping. I have the Simon Says Stamp Best Year Yet stamp set. This is a perfect set for birthday cards. You have a bunch of sentiments here and also beautiful images. I won't be using any of the images, but I do love all of the sentiments in this set. And the way I want to do my sentiments on my cards is a little bit different. I want to create a shadow for the sentiment. I want the shadow in gray ink, and I want to have the sentiment itself heat embossed in white embossing powder. So here's an example of a card I already did using a lighter version of this abstract direct-to-paper background and a shadow heat embossed sentiment. It's super easy to do, and the card ends up looking very clean and simple, and it doesn't take long to make. Yet the process is fun because you get to play with the different ink colors, making that colorful background. I have my mini MISTI stamping tool and the background already placed inside the MISTI. I'm first going to stamp the sentiment in gray ink, and the color I'm using is charcoal. And again, the idea is to stamp the shadow in gray. I'm actually going to double stamp this and then do the main sentiment in white embossing powder. Now, I did set my panels aside to dry after all of my stamping and color application was done. I had an errand to run, so I left my panels to sit and air dry for about an hour. A drying time for you will depend on many things. It can be how much ink you applied to the paper, the humidity in your room, the temperature in your room, and so on. So always test your panel before you do any heat embossing. And the way you test it is you use your anti-static powder tool and then pour embossing powder on it and see if the embossing powder sticks to any areas. If it does, your panel needs a little bit more time to dry, and you can either let it air dry or use your heat tool. I prefer to let mine air dry if, that's a possibility, if I have enough time. But if I don't, I will use a heat tool, and I always try to do my best to avoid any warping. So I have tested my panels, and next I positioned the sentiment over the gray stamped sentiment, and I made sure it was offset. I offset it just a tiny bit, just a hair. On some sentiments, you can offset them a little bit more, depending on how big the sentiment is. This one has very detailed lines, so I didn't want to offset it too much, as that would have placed the shadow too far from the main sentiment, and that might have looked awkward. I treated my paper with an anti-static powder tool. This is a tool from Simon Says Stamp. I love using it. It's very handy and very convenient for heat embossing. I don't know how I did my heat embossing before without this tool. And so next I inked up my stamp with clear embossing ink and stamped my sentiment onto the panel. Now I did double stamp it to be sure, because why not? And next I added the white detail embossing powder. I'm using detail powder here as this is a detailed sentiment. Now I did use the same embossing powder, the detail powder, on the other sentiment, the one that is a big solid shape. And I should have used regular embossing powder for that one, but using detail powder worked fine. Not perfect, but good enough. I next heat set the powder to melt it, and here's a look at this fabulous offset sentiment. Doesn't that shadow look cool? I love it. Such a simple trick, but it adds a great deal of detail to your card, and it's so easy to do. Next, I heat embossed additional sentiments from this same stamp set and the same detail white embossing powder on black cardstock, and I cut them out to tiny rectangles. I trimmed each of my panels to 3.5 by 4 3/4 inches, and next I used a layer of white fun foam to foam mount the panels onto A2 card bases. So very simple design. I have a colorful background and a simple sentiment with a beautiful gray shadow. I also foam mounted the additional sentiment rectangles, and next I used the same gray ink to stamp some additional stars onto the background. I also added sequins to some of my cards, just to add a little bit of sparkle. So here's a look at the cards I have for you today. I loved making these and I hope you enjoyed this video too. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. I hope you'll like these ideas. If you make a card inspired by this video, as always guys, we would love it if you shared your project online and tagged us on social media. We always love seeing what you make. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys and I'll see you next time.
I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at simonsaysstamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.